Good morning, and thank you for joining us today, and welcome to Regulation Navigation with Warren Miller, brought to you by ITS. This is our second informational webinar this year, and we plan to continue this series centered around various regulation-related topics that cover operator qualification basics and give an opportunity for you to learn something new, validate what you already know, or get answers to a question that you may have. Today, we'll gain an understanding of the recently updated New York OQ rule and what the implications may be for the industry. We'll be discussing the changes that we view as significant and recommend you do the same. We're providing you a tool to do so. After the webinar, we'll send out a link to a downloadable spreadsheet listing all the former and new regulation parts. I'm Chris Taylor. I'm the Director of Learning and Content Development at ITS, and I'm here to facilitate this discussion. And with me is former PHMSA regulator and ITS Regulatory Compliance Specialist, Warren Miller. Thanks for joining us, Warren. To our audience, thank you all for joining us as well, as I'm sure we're all eager to learn more about this rule. Before we get started though, just a bit of housekeeping to ensure this experience is beneficial for all of you. This session is recorded. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please submit those in the question and answer feature in Zoom, or this Q&A feature. It's got a button. We will have time at the end of this discussion for Warren to answer your questions, and if we're unable to get to all of them during the session, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually afterwards. The information and views expressed in this webinar series may be opinion and do not constitute legal advice, and you should not utilize it as your only source of information. Please review the disclaimer on the screen before acting on any advice given, and seek guidance from legal counsel or other applicable experts if you have particular questions, issues, or concerns. So without further ado, let's jump into it. New York State published an update to the state regulations, Section 255, back in March of this year. Several years ago, the State Public Service Commission issued a white paper and followed that up with a notice of proposed rulemaking process where they solicited public and industry comment. Again, to be clear, the regulation we're going to discuss today only affects New York State operators. But Warren, before we dive into the new rule and its requirements, why should operators outside of New York understand what's in it? How is it relevant to the greater industry?
Well, Chris, this goes back to the original history on OQ. It was a negotiated rulemaking back in 97 through 98. Original rule came out August 27th of 99. And then PHMSA had published a notice proposed rulemaking for OQ back in July 15. Many of the points in the OQ New York rule actually mimic what was in that notice proposed rulemaking. Of course, in July of 2020, the final rule was not published by PHMSA, and by law, not taking action after 5 years, that rulemaking was canceled. So that's how the federal side and all of the states are affected by the rule. Now, if you go to the New York, they published this rule. It was effective in March 18th, 2022, and with some established deadlines. Of course, this started with a white paper back in 2017, I believe. Probably the biggest things is that by April 1st of 23, so much less than a year, a written program for any operator that's working in the state of New York, they must meet the requirements of these new regulations. So any training or evaluations after April 1st of 2023, they'll have to be meeting the requirements, basically the implementation of the written program. And then thirdly, a program effective measurement will have to be completed by March 18th of 25. It was specifically called out in the rule that 3 years from the date, the effective date of the rule, that the first program effectiveness measurement would have to take place. So these are kind of the big overall points of this regulation, and what we're going to do is dive into some of the specifics.
So in other words, the New York rule didn't come out of thin air. It's had a background at the federal level as well. It just has not been issued into final rule, and there's no new notice of proposed rulemaking on similar items currently. Something we'll need to be watching out for possibly, though. As we mentioned in the introduction, after today's session, we'll be sending out a link to download a spreadsheet that you can use as a tool to help you analyze the rule yourselves. Warren, we use the tool to conduct our own analysis, and can you explain to our audience how they can use it?
You bet. Basically, it's just an Excel spreadsheet, and we took each section and subsection and placed it on the left-hand side, and then broke down first what was in place before the new New York rule came out. So in certain points, there is something there. In certain places, like program effectiveness, there is not. And then the after column is what is now in the regulation. So that's how we broke this down by section, so we could kind of really see the details that was going to require to review this. The next to last column on the right is the PDF and page. So one of the things it will also be providing is the PDF of the regulation, so you can, if you don't have easy access to it, that you can have that again to refer back to. And then the last column is your ranking. Would recommend that you kind of look at that after our discussion today. Here at ITS, we reviewed each section with the consideration of what actions we believe most operators will have to take to be timely into the development of any changes. And we ranked the top 5 with a few honorable mentions, and that's what we're going to visit about today. We'd recommend that each of you look at the spreadsheet and regulation and develop your own company strategy to achieve appliance with regard to your own system. You may be further ahead, or you may be behind, certain areas that will take more time for you to have your program in place and in compliance for those dates we just talked about.
Thank you for that, and we hope you find that tool valuable. So we analyzed the New York rule, and as Warren just said, we highlighted the major elements that we viewed as significant changes to the law. And now we've labeled those in this presentation as we move forward, covering them as key points. And you'll see that on the screen. We've also included a couple of honorable mentions that we'll cover later in this presentation. Among the updates to Section 255, there are 3 definitions that were updated and 2 were added. Warren, can you walk us through the most significant of those definitions?
I can. The New York rule enacts the requirements for covered tasks, very similar to B31Q, which will require individual companies to review their covered task list and make necessary additions. Covered tasks are all activities identified by the operator that are performed on a pipeline facility and affect the safety or integrity of the pipeline. That's not safety of the people, safety of the pipeline. This really opens the door. One of the areas that it's going to be very specific about for New York, if you're not already there, is new construction. So this requires all the activities that are identified by the operator, not the contractor. Contractors aren't supposed to identify the covered tasks they'll be performing for the operators. The operator is. Performed on a pipeline that will affect the safety or integrity. Inspectors are going to be looking to see what an operator has identified and then fully developed out. One of the things that really recommend, and I think this is why this is the key point and probably the most time consuming, this is while you're developing these new covered tasks, you're looking at your task versus what you do on your system. You've got to make considerations. Okay, what abnormal operating conditions? What are the span of control ratios are we going to allow? Reevaluation intervals. Going to have to kind of develop those as you put these covered tasks together. One thing I would like to remind you as a caveat, that if you do have access to the ASME B31Q standard, that covered task list, don't consider that all inclusive. That is a voting group of people, and it has to be 100% consensus. And there are folks that have covered tasks that are not on that list, but that do affect the safety or integrity of their pipeline. So don't just grab the B31Q, download those, and think you're done. I really want to make sure this is going to be to your system.
So when you go from a 4-part requirement of what is to be considered a covered task and down to a 2-part, I think by principle, that opens up so many more possibilities for additional covered tasks. Do you think as well that operators will end up identifying more? Is that pretty much a guarantee? They will. With this key point 1A and then the next one talking about that, it's requiring for operators to make sure this is specific to their system. So this is going to depend on the type of operations. It's going to drive development of those new covered tasks, again with consideration of the product, pressures, type of equipment, and other factors that are associated to that equipment depending on where they're operating. By taking out required by this part, Kayla, if you'll go to that next slide. By taking out required by the part, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have been. It's the last slide. I think it's the last. I apologize. I got ahead of myself here. By taking out the one requirement of required by this part, that opens up the door to everything that operator is doing. May have an O&M, may have a standard for performing, not just what's required by the code regulatory wise to valves, inspections of rectifiers and things like this. This is those other things, filters. Does it affect when you're in there, changing charge? Are there, is there having to look at those other aspects and operations that an operator is performing? So it's going to take each operator some time to make these reviews and come up with their specific list. Well, moving on to key point number 2 that we identified, what about the training requirements for the existing tasks and for new tasks?
Well, that's just it. This is detail. The training requirements included the minimum training required per covered task. So you've got to develop your new covered task and then take your old covered task and ensure that you've got established training requirements for each one, making sure that each individual performing the covered task is provided the knowledge and skills to be qualified and requalified when necessary. So again, if there's a covered task that doesn't require training, it's going to be, probably a, very low consequence, low complexity. But I think you're gonna have to at least put down this the training and say, per these tasks, we've got to have folks trained to this level. So an operator has to ensure that everyone has the training required prior to the individuals performing the test. Performing to actually taking the test. So after development of this training for these covered tasks, one of the things I'd recommend is performing a needs assessment on your employees to determine their current status.
So what is a needs assessment? How is that typically approached?
Well, Chris, this would entail an operator having a system or a process to review each employee's status of work performance, OQ history, and documented training history. This would help those responsible, again, and probably the administration of the program, responsible for training to establish what resources are going to be needed to complete the training and is necessary.
Okay.
So if you've got some tenured personnel that may be 80 to 90, have 80 to 90% of the training completed and documented. That's another big thing that, if you've got that documentation of that training, it's going to be very important for you for this new rule. While new personnel may require every training class, and then depending on class size and logistics, trainers could be very busy once this program is implemented. And do want to make sure I mention that April 1st of 2023, that's the implementation date.
So this needs assessment that you'd recommend to really get your arms around understanding where you are in your training needs for your company. This sounds like a perfect use case for our Onboard Assure app. This is an assess anything type of app we have at ITS. For those of you not familiar, it's a form builder within our learning management system that deploys out to a mobile app for your evaluators, your assessors, your auditors, your instructors, to essentially assess those items on the form. So you could build a list of questions, and then those inputs, those submissions by your assessors will aggregate into like a dashboard where you can really take action on all of these things and really analyze what is the state of my program, or what is the state of anything really. What kind of questions are typically asked, excuse me, on during a needs assessment to those individuals or those departments?
Well, with the, good information that I'd use to, start the process would be job title, especially if you have your covered task assignments by role. Tenure, is this somebody brand new? Is it somebody that's been on the job for a while? Certainly, if it's not assigned by job title, the covered tasks that they're performing, types of equipment they're utilizing. So if you're a company that actually works in multiple divisions and you've got certain equipment in different manufacturers of equipment, different locations, it may make a difference in what kind of training needs to be done there. And then types of documented training that each individual already has. So, if there's basics that, people have to have, and then you've got some folks that have been around the job, they've been through line locating training and all that stuff, and there's documentation. That's going to be important for the records keeping portion of this regulation.
Yeah, as we typically always say on this webinar, in some shape or form, if you don't document it, it didn't happen in the eyes of regulators. So yeah, that's going to be key here. Next up to discuss, we'd like to talk about the definition of what qualified means now in the new New York rule, and it's become much more specific. So the prior rule defined it as an individual can perform the covered task and recognize and react to abnormal operating conditions, or AOCs. Warren, what was added to this definition of qualified, and why is it significant?
Well, the rule added 3 additional defining points requiring demonstration of knowledge, skills, and physical ability to perform the covered task. And they broke it down into the specific 3, 4, and 5. This sets the bar for the evaluation methods for each covered task. It does not have any leeway, appears to have any leeway of doing anything such as written only or performance only. They've set the bar. Included is the knowledge to make equipment selection, no calibration equipment, other specifics. Skill changes include the variations that may be encountered performing a task due to equipment, environmental conditions, and context difference. If something occurs on site that you're going, oh, we may not can do that. Something's going on Very much like you plan on doing a hot tap and you get out there and there's actually no way to get to the pipe because you've got interference from water pipes or electrical lines and things like that, and understanding, we may have to make some changes. And then lastly, to demonstrate the physical ability to perform the covered task. That puts it that every operator is going to actually have to determine that anybody that's grabbing that valve to close it or having to lift something to perform a covered task can actually do it.
Thank you. One of the new rules requirements is to essentially document, measure, evaluate, and improve an OQ program's effectiveness. And the New York rule identifies at minimum 13 specific deficiency areas that must be considered in instances where an individual's performance of a covered task adversely affected the safety or integrity of a pipeline. So Warren, how does this new requirement contrast to the current federal regulations?
Well, there is no requirement. OQ is the only regulation that PHMSA has put out in years that did not have a program effectiveness requirement. Again, a negotiated rulemaking back in 97, 98, they left that part out. So this rule included the requirement for operators to measure the OQ program effectiveness as it relates to individual performances that might adversely affect the safety or integrity of the pipeline. One of the things we want to talk about is adversely effects is really not defined as an accident. So damage not resulting in a leak would be one instance where the operator needs to determine what category, if any, the conditions could be contributed to. That's part of that.
Yeah, and so essentially the requirement is to count these instances and have an accounting and then come together as your company and review those and then take action onto any identified areas that could improve the program. And this is, I think, this is setting some precedent out there as to this is a great start for those of you not in New York who do care or want to put into place program effectiveness measures. Here's a great start. Here's definitely some areas that you should look at. And although you're not required, this could definitely apply to other programs that could benefit from it. Those in New York who are required, they will essentially be counting these and documenting these instances, and then documenting the review of this, and then I think documenting the changes made to their program in order to comply with the program effectiveness requirements. Is that about right? Yeah,
Chris. These 13 measures here, an operator is going to actually have a review process. So if a line is mislocated and a pipeline gets hit, or there's a near miss, if they have that terminology in their program, then they've got to say, okay, of these 13, is there something here that, if done correctly, that wouldn't have happened? Span of control wasn't followed, or the evaluator did not follow the program or meet the requirements, so he really wasn't qualified to evaluate the individual who adversely affected the pipeline. And again, they would add these up at the end of, like I said, by the time of March 18th, they would have a list here, hopefully not many, but they would have a list. And if they see a trend where training wasn't adequate for that covered task, or change wasn't communicated well to, say, maybe to a contractor, then they would say, okay, this is one of our points of, we've measured it and now we need to be more effective. What are we going to do to make this better? Trying to minimize a repeat of the actions that they found in this process.
It really forces an investigation into root cause. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line there. And then, I wanted to mention this is another great use case for the Onboard Assure app, because they could put each one of these measures in there and start documenting them as they occur, in various areas of their business and operations. So if you want to know more about that, if you're a New York operator, please reach out to us. I'd love to talk to you about that. Requirements for the evaluations themselves are also now, like you mentioned, with some of the specifics, are much more explicit in the new rule in other ways too. So Warren, what stands out most to you? And I think we labeled this as key point number 5.
Probably the biggest change is that the evaluations must occur at least 48 hours after training. So the regulation says evaluations shall not be conducted within 48 hours. And so you're going to be having to have timetables or date and time that evaluations occur, be able to track this.
What's the reasoning behind, I mean, what do you think the intent of that is?
The intent was to ensure that there was a delineation between training and evaluations in a number of situations. When I was with PHMSA and even since, evaluations, training was occurring right up to the second that you start the evaluation. And that really doesn't provide for that long-term memory. Short-term memory, somebody passed something real quick. Again, you're trying to make sure these folks are qualified. So when they go out by themselves in the middle of the night or during a storm, that they're able to remember and take the correct actions and perform that covered task safely. Second biggest change for this requirement is that any AOC question in the evaluation, so whether you're doing it in written or performance, skill training, whatever, if the individual fails any AOC question, which is now considered a critical question, they would fail the evaluation. So AOCs are being driven real hard by this new rule, and operators will have to emphasize, I think, more, because again, you're trying to make sure that their training is required, but they're gonna, when the evaluation has an AOC question that, let's say you've gotten everything but one AOC question that you fail that evaluation. It will be quite a change in philosophy on emphasizing what AOCs are and how to recognize and react.
And again, those need to be specific to the operator too, and their system.
Correct. They got to have that specificity. And then lastly, probably the big thing is if observation on the job is used an evaluation method, and it can be, but not as a sole method. The operator's OQ procedures must define measures that they would use to determine that that individual along the process of observation on the job has a successful completion. So you've got to have criteria established to say, he's done this in this timely manner, not had any issues. And again, if depending on how you're documenting, are you documenting AOCs at the same time? There's going to have to be some defined processes in the OQ procedures. Interesting.
Well, another new requirement, and I think we're into our honorable mentions now. Another new requirement is that records must now be kept for covered tasks performed by non-qualified individuals. So in other words, those working under span of control being directed and observed by qualified individuals. So that now that documentation now needs to be kept according to the new rule. Is that right?
Correct. So they'll be kept and made available for audit. It's specifically spelled out that way for work completed by a non-qualified individual that's been directed and observed by a qualified individual. So this is something that, again, has not been required by federal law. And in doing so, this is, puts additional record keeping requirements on an operator. But at the same time, it also provides documentation for if you're trying to train somebody up to be qualified, this would kind of meet the last thing we talked about was on-the-job training. So there's a positive out of this if you're going to use non-qualified individuals in the case that if you were going to qualify them, but again, having criteria established. And
So,
then still the requirement for having records of prior qualification at least for 5 years.
okay, so you're saying that, because of this span of control documentation of unqualified workers, I mean, a lot of that is on the job training, and you have a dual purpose here with those records, and you can also demonstrate, with these records, here's all of the on the job training that, these folks were actually conducting this, under span of control, and that can be used for that. That's
Utilize it that way if they want to, but then again, they're going to have to ensure that they're following the processes that are defined.
Of course, it needs to actually be training. Well, other record keeping, I want to mention that ITS has another app, and we're all about the apps, but it's called OQ Verify or ITS Verify. And what it is an OQ field verification app. So it essentially lets daily your crew foreman leads or whoever check in at a JSA session or at a muster point and actually check the qualifications of any individual on there to make sure they're still qualified to do so. It documents that check, and it also lets them document any non-qualified individual and assign span of control to the qualified individual, and it takes care of all that documentation. It just takes a minute or two out of the day, and all this can happen. This span of control documentation can happen using that app. So if that interests anyone, even outside of New York, please get in touch with us. We'll have contact information at the end of the session. Other record keeping requirements, another honorable mention that were further defined as well, including the requirement to document the evaluation of AOCs and training. So you want to talk about that a little, Warren?
Sure. Again, the original, the federal rule and all the states followed had the 4 requirements. So now it's specifically stating that you've got to have individual records that show the evaluation of ability to recognize and react, whether they're task specific or non-task specific, that could occur anywhere on an operator system. So, they're calling it out specifically. How are you doing that? What's that evaluation going to look like? And then the training that took place to support the individual's qualification or requalification for each covered task. Again, this goes back to that requirement of developing the training requirements, and now you've got to support that. Again, it doesn't, I'm taking some latitude here, which may not be correct because I've not actually talked to New York about this, but I'm assuming that if somebody has had their training that had been required and it does not change, that documentation would allow, support that individual's qualifications right now. Now, if requalification requires some additional training, then certainly they're going to have that documentation. But the specific list that's required for individuals' records has increased just a little bit.
Thank you. Among all of the additional requirements for OQ programs added by the new rule, there was a bit of relief granted for atmospheric corrosion monitoring, I believe. What changed here?
This is specific to the service line onshore.
Okay.
Before had been every 3 years, not to exceed 39 months. And that has been relaxed to every 5 years, not to exceed 63 months, which is consistent with the federal regulation. So this is something that it should be, some relief to an operator.
Yeah, especially I guess with those in more highly populated areas where there's more service lines,
Exactly.
it should be a significant relief. Warren, the new rule also lays out requirements for a written program for what are termed as higher risk engineering functions. Would this look like OQ or what? Tell us more about it.
Well, at one time it was talked about, having a registered engineer sign off on anything that would be done, for an operator. And they allowed that the operator shall determine those functions specific to design that contain an elevated risk. So again, if it's been standard operation to do, certain things, and again, knowing the history of each operator is going to be critical. Then if they would need to ensure that engineers that are working for them, that there's a program in place that includes training, mentoring, and an evaluation process to establish competency. The one thing this doesn't address, it doesn't address those operators who, one, have never used an engineer or maybe subcontract out to an engineer. How will they comply with this regulation? And I think that's something that, any operator that's in that position needs to, contact your regulator up in that area and say, okay, since we've not used engineers, how are we to comply with this? And, be ahead of that rather than waiting until somebody says, how are you doing it? And you don't have an answer.
Well, we'll be taking questions coming up here in just a minute. So be sure to enter any that you have through the Q&A feature here in Zoom. Again, we'll answer as many as we can, and or maybe all, and then end in the webinar a little early. We'll see how we fare. Warren, before we get to those questions, so be entering those in. Can you take us through a recap? What are the top 5 takeaways from today's session?
Well, certainly the new covered task. That's going to be, again, my take on it, certainly not an operator's take, but developing those new covered tasks that will have to be performed on your facilities, and ensuring that you do the whole development, and that includes their span of control, reevaluation intervals, and the critical AOCs. And again, all AOCs are now considered critical in New York. And then establishing training requirements for all the covered tasks, as applicable. So taking the new ones plus the old ones and say, okay, here's our minimum requirements for somebody to line locate, for somebody to work on a rectifier, whatever it is, making sure that is in place, and that needs to again, that requirement would have to be developed. I mean, those requirements have to develop it, and then what kind of training are you going to have to develop? You've made the requirements, then you've got to develop it, and then you've got to amend the evaluation methods to capture the operating, capture our operating different equipment, physical abilities. It basically makes you, knowledge, skills, and ability, have that type of evaluation for each of the employees for each of the covered tasks. Program effectiveness. Again, it's a brand new term for many folks. Some have heard it, but this is now going to be required for the operators in New York to develop this, gather the information, and measure their program, and then make changes as it's warranted by the findings of that review. And lastly, ensuring those evaluations are performed separated from training at least 48 hours, and then documenting They've called out 48 hours specifically, and I think that they will be looking at date and time very seriously on each line item. So be very cognizant of tracking and documenting both the training and the evaluations.
Thank you for taking us through those and walking through those in depth earlier. Again, this rule currently applies only to New York State. But what do you talked a little bit about this at the very beginning of the intro. What do you see as the effect this rule could have impacting beyond New York State?
I think state programs will probably watch what happens with New York and see positives or negative outcomes of it. What changes occur. Some may take a look at the regulations, say, hey, we like some of this, or we don't like part of this, and certainly each state is allowed to make their own regulations as long as they're more stringent than PHMSA. They cannot go any less stringent. Again, I think it's more of a let's see what happens more than anything.
And would you consider this, as far as I know you probably haven't reviewed, or you may have actually, but every state's specific regulations, but would you view this as the most stringent now in the country, or most clear or explicit?
It's very well spelled out. Yes, there are some states that require new construction. They required new construction some years ago to be part of OQ, but this is definitely probably this is the most stringent right now. And I'm sure there's other states that will look and again see where parts of this or all of this could help them. And like I said, PHMSA may or may not address any changes in the OQ regulation with all that's going on with all the other programs that are out there and driven from Congress and NTSB. OQ may not rise to the top right now for a while.
Well, it's now time for us to take your questions. We've got a number in the queue, so thank you for those and keep them coming in. Again, we will engage with you if we don't get to it by the end of the webinar. The ITS Marketing Director, Kayla Huggins, is here. She's going to help us ask those questions. Kayla, what's our first one?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Warren, we did have a couple that came through during registration, so I do want to pitch one of those to you this morning. Will this New York OQ rule affect the city of New York as well as the state? Will there be different criteria within regards to the rules that have been discussed today?
Kayla, to my knowledge, New York City would also fall under this regulation. I do not believe that they have anything that is more stringent than this, or that they have an exception. There are, I think there's only one town in the country that I can think of that has an exception to some of the rules that's required by the state, but I don't believe New York City is one of them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Warren. Our next question, it relates to our very first key point that we covered this morning. I'm going to read that to you, Warren, so you can refer to this. It's that covered tasks are all activities identified by the operator that are performed on a pipeline facility and affect the safety or integrity of the pipeline. So this question is asking, are operations and maintenance tasks performed as a requirement of this part 2?
Well, they are, but this does not exclude all the other parts. That's what this regulation does. It opens it up to more than O&M. It opens it up to construction. It opens it up to pressure of course, pressure testing was a part of it too. But anything inside Part 192 is now fair game if it's being performed on that pipeline.
Great. Thank you, Warren. Our next question is, do you anticipate a qualified record will have to show the completed training along with the past WE and PE?
Oh, I would most certainly think that it's going to have to, especially showing that 48-hour time difference also. So, you know, whatever training the operator has chosen for that covered task, they will have to have performed that. And then 48 hours later, they could have a written or performance. Yes.
Right. How would you document if there was a deficiency in the field that wasn't caught?
How would I document it that wasn't caught? Well, that's the unknown. I mean, if something happens out there that the operator doesn't know about, there's no way for him to, you know, have a place to measure it. That's the thing about, you know, personnel, you know, saying, you know, we've got a line hit, we need to repair this. Okay, why'd the line hit occur? But if nobody reports, you know, on that crew or that contractor that they hit that line, even though it didn't rupture, you know, those are all over the place, and that occurs more than we want to have happen. And later on, corrosion occurs, or, you know, failure occurs later.
Great. Currently, the only tasks that do not allow for span of control are the tasks that require a PE, such as like pipe joining or tapping. Do you believe the span of control requirements will change with the new PEs per task coming out in the near future?
This is interesting because I actually the other day read in the original OQ rule that was published in 1999 that operators were to qualify everyone, and that the span of control, the use of non-qualified individuals, was just for that time frame for somebody to get qualified. And of course, now it's used, you know, countrywide as a standard practice. I think more and more as this comes about, with this here in New York requiring all of the documentation on it, I think it will drive some operators to say, why am I have a non-qualified individual and a qualified individual, paying them both to be there when one person that's qualified could do it?
Thank you, Warren. Our next question is, what constitutes a higher risk function in regards to engineers?
Well, let's talk about what happened in Boston, talking about, you know, going from a low pressure to a high pressure system, and the testing and, you know, planning and engineering that certainly would take, you know, a higher, that would be one of those higher functions that you'd want somebody that really understands, okay, this system is running low pressure, we've got a crossover down here, we've got high pressure, you know, are we covered? Do we have the necessary safety devices in place in case something were to occur that we don't overpressure system? That's my first one that I could think of.
Thank you. Our next question is, do you think that PHMSA will be reviewing New York's applicability of the new rule requirements and consider making those changes for the federal OQ rules?
Well, again, as I stated when we first started, a lot of this rule actually came from that notice proposed rulemaking that came out in July of 2015. Understand that if PHMSA has to go through a rulemaking, it will be the whole process again. That, you know, 3, maybe 5 years to complete that process. That includes docket, that includes cost benefit analysis, that includes regulatory hearing with the technical committees, and then also putting it out for public comment. I mean, it would have to be done all over again since July 2020 passed with the original notice proposed rulemaking.
How do you think this will affect the contractors who work for the New York State operators? Should the contractors view this the same as the operators should?
Yes. The thing is that the operators are going to have to pass on and communicate what they're going to require. So these contractors coming in, they would have had to have, just for instance, separation of their training and evaluation 48 hours. If my assumption is that the state would be auditing any contractor in there for the operator, and they would have to meet the same requirements.
Our next question is, they've been hearing this term, the program effectiveness phrase, for years, but still, not sure on how to measure that. What are some measurable elements to meet this expectation that truly measure if your OQ program is effective?
Well, again, these 13 elements, put you in that position. Let's just go with line locates. An operator has line locates, let's say 100 a month, over the period of 2 years, that's 2,400. How many were accurate? If they weren't accurate, the question they need to be asking is, why wasn't it accurate? Was it our maps, which is not related to OQ, but certainly it's related to their program, or was it related to the fact that that individual wasn't trained to read those maps correctly, or those individuals? That's the kind of, that's where New York is hoping to, minimize and slow those. And again, when I'm saying adverse conditions, again, if somebody had hit the pipe, if somebody cuts open the pipe, that automatically becomes, okay, it's going to fall somewhere, and it may not fall in the program effectiveness, but it's going to fall somewhere in their program. But those 13 issues were laid out as catch-alls for the OQ program effectiveness, not the operator's O&M program, which, OQ is a sub-part, basically.
Thank you, Warren.
Hope I answered that.
No, that was great. I'm going to finish with just one more question. I know I've been throwing a lot at you. This last question is, what should operators do and what should operators avoid when approaching the implementation of these changes?
Don't wait, because this is, April 1st is going to come quickly. I'd recommend that you consider with the development of your covered task, not just somebody from the office, but somebody from the field, having a supervisor sit down. You may want to go by divisions and saying, okay, in measurement, or, in new construction, these are places that could adversely affect the safety or integrity of the pipeline. And take a look at the list, and then start working on the covered task. If you have a OQ group, that would be looking at span of control and reevaluation intervals and things like that. Have them start, but the time established as far as when it's got to be done, and depending on the size of your program, it could take some folks a while to get it all in place by April 1st.
Well, we're going to wrap up now. Warren, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, the time it took you and our teams to review the New York rule and create this webinar. We've been getting a lot of feedback that this is valuable, so thank you for that, and we hope it continues to be so for you, our audience. Thank you for spending time with us as well. If you have any questions or concerns, and I think there were a number, just a few questions we didn't get to, so we'll be sure to reach back out to you individually for those. But if you have any questions or concerns about your own OQ plan or program, whether you're in New York or not, Warren Miller and our ITS team are here to help. We offer a range of consulting services and solutions So please reach out to us with your needs. I would love to talk to you. We have our next webinar slated for Wednesday, August 10th. Registration is now live for that webinar. You can sign up today by visiting our website at its-training.com/regnav. We'll be sharing that downloadable spreadsheet we mentioned throughout this, and we'll get that over to you via the email, the address you signed up with, you can do your own comparisons. We recommend you use that to really look at each part of the rule and make sure that you aren't missing anything. We hope to continue we hope you continue joining us on these sessions. Again, thank you for the feedback that you've been giving us, and stay safe out there.